The boy in the box investigation is the oldest homicide cold case in the city. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was just 4 years old when someone dumped his body in a box.
In February 1957, the discovery of a child's body abandoned in a cardboard box in the woods of Philadelphia became one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. For over 65 years, the small boy wrapped in a blanket and stuffed inside a JCPenney bassinet box remained nameless, known only as the boy in the box or America's unknown child.
One of Philadelphia's oldest unsolved homicides. The story of who would come to be known as America's unknown child.
Generations of detectives worked tirelessly on the case, following countless leads that ultimately led nowhere. Then, in 2022, a breakthrough finally came. Using advanced DNA technology and genetic genealogy, Philadelphia police announced what many thought impossible.
We would not be here today to give America's formerly unknown child, Joseph Augustus Zarelli.
They had identified the boy. This is the story of a mystery 6 decades in the making, how modern science finally provided answers to the questions that still remain. It was a cold winter afternoon when Frederick Benonis, a college student checking his muskrat traps in Philadelphia's Fox Chase neighborhood, spotted something unusual. Initially hesitant to contact authorities due to his illegal trapping, Benonis eventually called police on February 25, 1957, after a radio report about a missing child triggered his conscience. What officers discovered would haunt the city for generations: the body of a small boy, approximately 6 years old, placed inside a cardboard box that once held a bassinet from JCPenney. The scene was meticulously documented. The child had been wrapped in a plaid blanket, his small body showing signs of malnourishment and abuse. His blonde hair had been crudely cut, seemingly after death, with clumps still clinging to his body. He wore no clothes but had been carefully wrapped and placed in the box. Most disturbing were the multiple bruises covering his thin frame, indicating a pattern of abuse that had preceded his death. Philadelphia was immediately gripped by the case. The local newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, published front-page stories with photographs of the unidentified boy, hoping someone would recognize him. Police distributed over 400,000 flyers throughout the area, posted them in gas stations, stores, and public spaces. The city's residents were both horrified and captivated by the mystery. How could a child vanish without anyone reporting him missing? The initial investigation moved quickly. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed residents, and checked records of missing children, yet no matches appeared. They traced the bassinet box to JCPenney, discovering that the specific model had been sold at stores throughout the region, creating an impossible number of potential leads. The blanket yielded no useful information, being a common style found in thousands of homes. Perhaps most perplexing was the complete absence of reports about a missing child matching his description. In a time before national databases and instant communication, investigators were limited to local resources, yet even within Philadelphia, no one had reported a blonde-haired boy of his age missing. It was as if he had never existed in the official records, a ghost child who appeared only in death. Decades of dead ends. What began as a shocking but presumably solvable case slowly transformed into one of America's most enduring mysteries. The investigation into the boy in the box entered a frustrating cycle of promising leads, followed by devastating disappointments that would continue for decades. The first major theory centered around a foster home located just a mile from where the body was discovered. Operated by Arthur and Catherine Nicoletti, the home had housed numerous children over the years. When investigators learned the couple had fostered a boy who later disappeared from their records, hopes soared. Police conducted extensive interviews and searches of the property, but ultimately found no connection. The missing foster child was located alive elsewhere, closing that promising avenue of investigation. By the 1960s, the case had grown cold but remained in public consciousness. Detective Remington Bristow became particularly obsessed, working the case even after his retirement in 1966. Bristow spent personal funds tracking leads, including one that led him to a New Jersey foster home where he believed the boy might have lived. He noted suspicious behavior from the family and similarities between a bassinet they owned and the box the boy was found in. Yet once again, The lead evaporated under scrutiny when further investigation failed to produce concrete evidence. The 1980s brought renewed attention when the boy's body was exhumed for additional forensic testing. New technologies allowed for more detailed examination, but the results only deepened the mystery. The testing confirmed the boy had never been seen by a dentist or doctor, at least not one who kept proper records. He had no surgical scars, no documented medical history, essentially no paper trail whatsoever. This absence from official records suggested possibilities ranging from illegal adoption to foreign birth, each theory creating its own web of complications. A psychic's tip in 1984 led to another exhumation and eventually to the boy's reburial in a proper cemetery plot donated by the city, replacing his unmarked potter's field grave. The headstone read simply, "America's Unknown Child," acknowledging the widespread impact of the case. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, various task forces revisited the evidence. The Vidocq Society, a group of forensic experts who examine cold cases, took special interest. They created enhanced facial reconstructions using new technology and distributed them widely. These efforts generated hundreds of tips, but no conclusive identification. Police pursued numerous theories. Was he from a traveling carnival, a victim of a human trafficking operation, a child born to a mother who couldn't acknowledge his existence? Each possibility was meticulously investigated before being reluctantly abandoned. The DNA breakthrough. The turning point in this seemingly unsolvable case began with advances few could have imagined when the boy's body was first discovered in 1957. The emergence of DNA technology in criminal investigations during the 1990s offered new hope, but initial attempts proved disappointing. Early DNA extraction from the boy's remains yielded degraded samples insufficient for the technology of that era. Each failure only reinforced the case's reputation as unsolvable. The real breakthrough came not just from improvements in DNA extraction and analysis, but from an entirely new approach to utilizing genetic information. In 2019, Philadelphia police partnered with genealogy experts to apply techniques that had recently solved other high-profile cold cases, most notably identifying the Golden State Killer in 2018. This methodology, known as genetic genealogy, represented a revolutionary shift in how investigators could approach unidentified remains. The process began with obtaining a viable DNA sample from the boy's exhumed remains, a challenging task given the age and condition of the body. Forensic scientists use specialized techniques to extract nuclear DNA from bone samples, focusing on areas that typically preserve genetic material longer. Unlike earlier attempts that relied on mitochondrial DNA, which only traces maternal lineage, this approach targeted the full genetic profile needed for comprehensive genealogical research. Once extracted, the DNA was sequenced and uploaded to public genealogy databases where individuals voluntarily share their genetic information. These databases differ from law enforcement DNA repositories like CODIS, offering broader family matching capabilities rather than just identifying exact matches from criminal records. The uploaded DNA profile didn't immediately identify the boy, but instead revealed distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, and other extended family connections. Genetic genealogists then constructed elaborate family trees working backward from these distant matches. This painstaking process required combining traditional genealogical research with genetic science. Teams examined birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, and social media to build complex family networks spanning generations. They looked for intersections between different family trees that could point to a missing child from the appropriate time period. The work proceeded slowly and methodically. Each potential family line required verification through additional DNA testing of living relatives who might be closer to the unknown boy. Many paths led to dead ends, while others required researching family histories in regions across the country. Complicating matters further, the team had to account for adoption, name changes, and undocumented relationships that might have obscured the child's lineage. By 2022, the genealogy work had narrowed the possibilities to a specific family connected to Philadelphia in the 1950s. Investigators then faced another challenge: finding living relatives close enough to confirm the identification. They located potential relatives and requested DNA samples explaining the long cold case that had haunted the city for generations. When these samples confirmed the relationship, investigators finally had what they'd sought for 65 years, a name for the boy in the box. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a name revealed. In December 2022, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw stood before assembled media to announce what many had thought impossible.
We would not be here today to give America's formerly unknown child, Joseph Augustus Zarelli.
After 65 years, America's unknown child finally had a name. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13, 1953, had been identified through the genetic genealogy work that connected him to his biological family. The announcement transformed an enduring symbol of mystery into a real boy with a history of family and a brief life story that had remained hidden for over 6 decades. The identification revealed that Joseph had been 4 years old when he died, slightly younger than initial estimates. He was born in Philadelphia to a family with Italian ancestry, explaining certain physical characteristics noted in the original autopsy. Records indicated that his birth was officially registered with the city, resolving one long-standing question about why no documentation of the child seemed to exist. As investigators pieced together Joseph's short life, they discovered a complicated family situation. His parents were not married, and public records suggested they had separated early in his life. The investigation revealed that Joseph had never been reported missing, confirming decades of speculation that whoever was responsible for his care was likely involved in his death. This painful reality explained one of the case's most perplexing aspects: how a child could vanish without generating any missing person reports. Authorities were careful about revealing Joseph's family connections. Police indicated that both his parents were deceased, as were many immediate relatives from that generation. Some living relatives were completely unaware of Joseph's existence until contacted by investigators. This suggested a family secret that had been carefully maintained for decades, with younger generations having no knowledge of a child who'd been born and died in the 1950s. The discovery of Joseph's identity unlocked additional records that had been impossible to locate without a name. Birth records confirmed his parentage, while scattered public documents offered glimpses into his family circumstances. Investigators found evidence that his mother had other children, some of whom had been raised separately from Joseph. These fragments painted a picture of family disruption and separation that placed Joseph in vulnerable circumstances. Perhaps most significant was what the identification represented beyond just a name. For decades, the boy in the box was a symbol of unsolved mysteries, of children who slip through society's protective systems, of the limitations of investigation techniques. Now Joseph Augustus Zarelli emerged as an individual, a real child whose life and death were no longer just a case study, but a personal tragedy. The Martha Theory. Among the theories that surfaced over decades of investigation, none garnered more attention than the account provided by a woman known publicly only as M. In February 2002, psychiatrist Joseph Maggio contacted the Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide Division regarding a patient whose story seemed to connect directly to the boy in the box case. This revelation, which investigators came to call the Martha Theory, presented the most detailed potential explanation of what happened to Joseph Zarelli in his final days. According to M's account, her abusive mother had purchased Joseph from his birth parents in 1954. The boy, whom the mother called Jonathan, was kept in the basement of their home and subjected to ongoing abuse. M described how her mother would force the child to take cold baths as punishment. During one such bath in February 1957, the mother became enraged when the boy vomited in the bath water. According to the account, she slammed him against the floor, causing a fatal head injury. The details provided were disturbingly specific. M claimed her mother cut the boy's hair after his death to make identification more difficult, then wrapped his body in a blanket and disposed of it in the Fox Chase area. These elements aligned perfectly with evidence from the crime scene: the hastily cut hair found on the body, the specific blanket, and the location. M even described how they had stopped at a diner after disposing of the body, a detail that seemed too specific to be fabricated. Investigators approached this information with caution but serious interest. They conducted extensive interviews with M, finding her consistently able to provide detailed information about the case. Some details she offered hadn't been publicly disclosed, lending credibility to her account. Detectives visited the house where M claimed the events occurred, discovering that the layout matched her description, including the basement where she said Joseph had been kept. The Martha theory gained significant traction among investigators because it explained several puzzling aspects of the case. It accounted for why no one had reported Joseph missing. He had been living outside official channels after being informally transferred from his birth family. It explained the evidence of long-term abuse seen on his body. Most importantly, it provided a coherent narrative that connected all the physical evidence. However, as with many elements of this case, complications emerged. Some investigators questioned M's credibility, noting inconsistencies in peripheral details of her story. Others believed her account might represent false memories or a conflation of events she had heard about with her own traumatic experiences. The family she described did exist, but conclusive evidence connecting them to Joseph Zarelli remained elusive. The identification of Joseph in 2022 neither fully confirmed nor disproved the Martha theory. While it established that the boy did indeed have a real identity and family separate from M's account, it didn't eliminate the possibility that he had been informally transferred to another family's care as described in her story. Investigators continued to examine this theory alongside other possibilities, recognizing that the truth might incorporate elements from multiple scenarios. Reconstructing Joseph's final days with Joseph's identity established, investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing what might have happened in the final chapter of his short life. This work combined traditional detective methods with insights from the recent DNA identification, creating a more detailed timeline than had ever been possible before. Medical evidence from the original autopsy, re-examined with modern forensic understanding, indicated that Joseph had suffered prolonged malnutrition and abuse before his death. His body showed multiple healing bruises of different ages, suggesting ongoing mistreatment rather than a single violent episode. The condition of his skin indicated he had been kept in unsanitary conditions, with the dermatologist noting patterns consistent with chronic neglect. Most tellingly, his stomach contained only a small amount of brown matter, possibly indicating he had been fed little in his final hours. The cause of death, originally listed as blunt force trauma, remained consistent with newer analysis. Joseph had suffered several severe blows to the head, with patterns suggesting he had been thrown against a hard surface rather than struck with an object. The medical examiner's conclusion that he died of cerebral hemorrhaging aligned with modern interpretations of the evidence. The timing of death was narrowed to approximately 24 to 48 hours before the body was discovered, placing his final moments around February 23, 1957. With Joseph's family connections established, investigators pieced together a troubling picture of his living situation. Records indicated his parents had separated, with Joseph apparently not living with either parent in a traditional arrangement. Interviews with distant relatives suggested a chaotic family environment with children distributed among various households, some with relatives, others in less formal arrangements. This fragmented care system explained how Joseph could have been abused without triggering intervention from authorities or even extended family. Weather records from February 1957 revealed a cold but not severe winter, with temperatures in the 30s and 40s during the days before Joseph's body was found. This information helped investigators understand the condition of the body and the practicalities of how it had been transported to the Fox Chase location. Tire impressions documented at the original crime scene, though never matched to a specific vehicle, indicated the perpetrator likely drove to the remote wooded area rather than walking there with the box. Perhaps most revealing was what the investigation into Joseph's final days didn't find. Any record of him attending school, visiting a doctor, or interacting with any official system in the weeks and months before his death. This absence confirmed that whoever was responsible for his care had deliberately kept him isolated from society, possibly to hide the ongoing abuse. Interviews conducted after his identification revealed that neighbors in several possible residences recalled seeing a small blonde boy who was rarely allowed outside to play with other children. These fragmented memories, impossible to pursue without knowing who to ask about, suddenly became valuable context once Joseph's identity and family connections were established. Potential suspects and justice delayed. The identification of Joseph Zarelli shifted the investigation from who was he to who was responsible. With a 65-year-old homicide, investigators faced extraordinary challenges in pursuing justice. Physical evidence had degraded, witnesses had died, and memories had faded, yet the case remained officially open, with detectives pursuing leads with renewed focus after establishing Joseph's identity. Central to the investigation were Joseph's parents and immediate caregivers. Police confirmed that both his biological parents were deceased, having died decades ago without ever publicly acknowledging what happened to their son. The investigation revealed complex family dynamics, with evidence suggesting Joseph may have been transferred to another's care through informal arrangements common in that era. This created an investigative challenge, determining who had legal responsibility for Joseph at the time of his death. Several persons of interest emerged from the family's extended network. Investigators examined relatives who had lived in Philadelphia during that period, particularly those with connections to the Fox Chase area where Joseph's body was found. They also revisited the Martha theory, attempting to identify the family described by M and determine if any connection existed between them and Joseph's biological family. These efforts involved reviewing employment records, property documents, and even tax filings from the 1950s to establish possible relationships or proximity. The passage of time created both obstacles and opportunities. While many potential witnesses and suspects had died, others who might have remained silent out of fear or loyalty in the 1950s were now willing to speak. Some elderly individuals approaching the end of their lives proved willing to share family secrets long kept hidden. Investigators conducted dozens of interviews with surviving family members and associates, some of whom had been children themselves when Joseph died. The investigation also benefited from evolving legal standards regarding evidence. Records that might have been protected by privacy laws in earlier decades became accessible as their confidentiality periods expired. Medical records, adoption documentation, and juvenile court proceedings from the 1950s provided context about how children in Joseph's situation might have been treated by authorities of that era. Philadelphia police made clear that the statute of limitations did not apply to homicide cases, meaning charges could still be filed if sufficient evidence emerged, regardless of how much time had passed. This legal reality meant that any surviving individual responsible for Joseph's death still faced potential prosecution, creating both investigative urgency and ethical considerations about pursuing justice for a crime committed so long ago. The most significant challenge remained forensic. While DNA had successfully identified Joseph, connecting physical evidence to a specific perpetrator proved more difficult. The original crime scene evidence had been handled by numerous people before modern contamination protocols existed, and items had degraded through decades of storage. Investigators focused on re-examining witness statements and circumstantial evidence that might corroborate or eliminate suspects identified through the family connection. The impact of genetic genealogy. The identification of Joseph Zarelli represents far more than just the resolution of a single case. It showcases the revolutionary impact of genetic genealogy on criminal investigations. This emerging field has fundamentally transformed how investigators approach cold cases, particularly those involving unidentified remains or unknown perpetrators. The Boy in the Box case provides a perfect case study of this technological revolution. Traditional DNA analysis in criminal investigations relies on direct comparison, matching crime scene DNA to samples from specific individuals or databases of known offenders. This approach requires having a suspect or hoping for a database hit. Genetic genealogy takes a radically different approach by using consumer DNA databases where individuals voluntarily upload their genetic profiles for ancestry research. These databases allow investigators to identify distant relatives of an unknown person and then work through family trees to narrow possibilities. The technique first captured public attention with the 2018 identification of the Golden State Killer Joseph James DeAngelo, who was linked to dozens of rapes and murders through genetic connections to distant relatives who had used commercial DNA testing services. This breakthrough demonstrated how perpetrators who had evaded justice for decades could suddenly be identified through their extended family's genetic information, even if they themselves had never submitted DNA. For unidentified victims like Joseph Zarelli, the technology's impact is equally profound. Traditionally, identifying unknown remains required matching them to specific missing person reports. In Joseph's case, the absence of any missing person report meant this approach was destined to fail. Genetic genealogy circumvented this limitation by connecting his DNA directly to his family tree, regardless of whether anyone had reported him missing. The ethical implications of this technology remain complex and evolving. Privacy advocates have raised concerns about law enforcement access to genetic information provided by individuals for genealogical research. Many services now specifically require users to opt into law enforcement matching, creating a balance between solving cold cases and protecting genetic privacy. The Joseph Zarelli identification benefited from individuals who had chosen to make their genetic information available for such purposes, essentially creating a crowdsourced approach to solving decades-old mysteries. Beyond individual cases, genetic genealogy has created ripple effects throughout cold case investigation units nationwide. Police departments have reopened files on unidentified remains. Cases once considered unsolvable are being re-examined, and families who spent decades wondering about missing loved ones are receiving answers. The National Institute of Justice estimates that approximately 40,000 unidentified human remains exist in the United States, each potentially identifiable through these techniques. The financial aspect of this technology has also evolved. While early genetic genealogy investigations cost tens of thousands of dollars, advances in DNA sequencing and analysis have dramatically reduced prices. Many departments now budget specifically for these services, while nonprofit organizations have emerged to fund genetic genealogy work for cases where resources are limited. America's Unknown Child Memorial. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli brought profound changes to the memorial that had honored him as an unknown child for decades. Since 1998, Joseph's remains had rested at Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, where his grave became a place of reflection and remembrance long before anyone knew his real name. The simple headstone that read America's Unknown Child had drawn visitors from across the country who felt compelled to connect with the case that represented all forgotten children. The cemetery plot itself has a poignant history. Originally buried in a potter's field with only a small marker, the boy's remains were exhumed in 1998 and reinterred at Ivy Hill through efforts by concerned citizens who believed the unknown child deserved a proper burial. The cemetery donated the plot while the Vidocq Society, a group of forensic experts devoted to solving cold cases, arranged for the headstone. Detective William Kelly, who investigated the case for years, attended the reburial ceremony, along with other officers who had made finding the boy's identity their personal mission. Over the decades, the gravesite evolved into something more than a memorial for one unidentified child. It became a symbol for all children who suffered from abuse and neglect. On holidays, particularly Christmas, visitors would leave toys, stuffed animals, and flowers. Some brought small cars or action figures, imagining what might have delighted a boy of his age. Others left notes expressing sorrow that he had never been claimed or identified. Each item represented a personal connection to a child known only through the circumstances of his death. When Joseph's identity was announced in December 2022, the memorial's significance transformed. Cemetery officials, in consultation with Philadelphia police and surviving distant relatives, planned modifications to the gravesite to incorporate his real name while preserving the symbolic importance it had acquired. The decision to maintain America's Unknown Child alongside his birth name acknowledged both his individual identity and his enduring significance as a symbol of all children who suffer in anonymity. The community's response to Joseph's identification revealed how deeply the case had embedded itself in Philadelphia's collective memory. Longtime residents shared stories of how their parents and grandparents had talked about the boy in the box. how the case had affected their own childhoods, and how they had followed developments over the decades. Many expressed a sense of closure mixed with renewed grief. The abstract, unknown child had become a real boy with a birth date, a name, and a tragically short life story. Memorial services held after the identification drew hundreds of attendees, including retired detectives who had worked the case, current Philadelphia police officers, and ordinary citizens who felt connected to Joseph's story. Speakers emphasized that while his identity had been established, the obligation to remember him and prevent similar tragedies remained unchanged. Religious leaders offered blessings that Joseph, after decades of being known only by what happened to him, could finally rest with his full identity acknowledged. The memorial continues to evolve as visitors now leave tokens with Joseph's name written on them, a simple act of recognition denied him for 65 years. Cemetery staff report that the number of visitors increased after his identification, suggesting that connecting a name to the story made his humanity more accessible rather than diminishing interest in his case. His grave serves as both a specific tribute to Joseph Augustus Zarelli and a broader memorial to all children who suffer abuse, particularly those whose stories remain untold. Cases solved through similar methods. The identification of Joseph Zarelli represents just one example of how genetic genealogy has revolutionized cold case investigations. Across the country, decades-old mysteries have yielded to this combination of cutting-edge science and traditional genealogical research, bringing closure to families and communities haunted by unsolved cases. Perhaps the most well-known parallel is the case of Mostly Harmless, an unidentified hiker found dead in a tent in Florida's Big Cypress National Preserve in 2018. Despite extensive publicity, including clear photographs of the living man distributed widely online, his identity remained unknown until genetic genealogy identified him as Vance Rodriguez in 2021. Like Joseph, Rodriguez had never been reported missing, explaining why traditional methods failed to identify him. The Bear Brook murders in New Hampshire revealed the power of genetic genealogy to unravel complex cases involving multiple victims. 4 unidentified bodies were discovered in barrels in Bear Brook State Park in 1985 and 2000. Traditional methods failed to identify the victims for decades until genetic genealogy identified 3 of them as Marlace Elizabeth Honeychurch and her daughters Marie Elizabeth Vaughan and Sarah Lynn McWaters in 2019. The investigation also identified their killer, Terry Peter Rasmussen, through similar techniques. The 1988 murder of 8-year-old April Tinsley in Fort Wayne, Indiana, remained unsolved for 30 years, despite DNA evidence from the crime scene. In 2018, genetic genealogy identified John D. Miller as the perpetrator through distant family matches. When confronted by police, Miller immediately confessed, later receiving an 80-year sentence. This case parallels Joseph Zarelli's in that both involved child victims and decades of frustrated investigation before genetic breakthroughs. Beth Doe, an unidentified pregnant woman whose dismembered remains were found in suitcases along the Lehigh River in Pennsylvania in 1976, was identified through genetic genealogy as Evelyn Colan in 2021. Her former boyfriend, Luis Sierra, was subsequently arrested for her murder. This case, occurring just 75 miles from where Joseph was found, demonstrates how the technology has brought justice to crimes that once seemed destined to remain unsolved. The Golden State Killer case stands as the watershed moment for this technology in crime solving. Joseph James DeAngelo's 2018 identification and eventual conviction for 13 murders and dozens of rapes demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy to identify perpetrators even without a direct DNA match in any criminal database. His identification opened the floodgates for similar investigations nationwide. In Washington state, the murder of 16-year-old Sarah Yarborough remained unsolved for 28 years until genetic genealogy identified Patrick Nicholas as the perpetrator in 2019. DNA left at the 1991 crime scene was preserved properly but yielded no matches until the genealogy approach connected it to Nicholas's relatives. The case of Christy Marak, a 25-year-old teacher murdered in Pennsylvania in 1992, parallels Joseph Zarelli's in terms of geography and investigative persistence. After 26 years without progress, genetic genealogy identified Raymond Rowe, a well-known DJ in the area, as the perpetrator in 2018. He later confessed and received a life sentence. These cases share common elements that illuminate why the identification of Joseph Zarelli matters beyond his individual case. Each represents years or decades of traditional investigation that reached dead ends. Each demonstrates how preserved evidence, even from eras before DNA analysis existed, can eventually yield answers when new technologies emerge. Most importantly, each case represents the transformation of an abstract mystery into a human story with real names, connections, and ultimately some measure of resolution.